In January 1943, a top-secret telegram from Reichsmarshal Göring arrived at the Petsamo Air Base. I was the first to read it. The Führer has ordered the establishment of 90 Air Force field brigades. That was serious. That meant me. It was a fallout from Stalingrad. The savage battle at the Volga was just drawing to its bitter end, leading inexorably to the annihilation of the Sixth Army. Close to 250,000 men were either dead, wounded and lucky to be evacuated, or on their way to Siberia. The fiasco at Stalingrad was my greatest shock during the Nazi era, except for the total defeat of 1945 and the devastating truth about the concentration camps. Of course, the official bulletin from Führer headquarters put the best face on the defeat. In a desperate attempt to boost morale, it closed with the pathetic phrase, "However, at this very hour, the divisions of the Sixth Army are already in the process of being re-established." Though I could not help noticing the uneasiness of the High Command hiding behind that stupid phrase, I was relieved that the military leaders, as I understood it, had finally awakened from their slumbers. Ill-informed as I was, I laid the blame for the disaster of Stalingrad at the general's feet, rather than Hitler's. I fervently hoped that the defeat would whip them into shape and prompt them to support the Führer wholeheartedly in his titanic struggle against the heirs of Genghis Khan. It still escaped me that this was not Stalin's war, but Hitler's. Indeed, the fact that the fiasco at Stalingrad was his fault alone was carefully hidden from the German people. But this was no time for fault-finding. This was time for action and sacrifice. I was ready. Though I hated the military with all my heart, I was willing to do my share to fill the army's depleted ranks. I knew I would be called very soon, but in my heart I had already volunteered at this crucial hour. It was the second and last time that I did this. On my radio, I listened to a rally in Berlin's renowned sports arena, where Goebbels delivered a powerful speech to an assorted crowd of wounded soldiers, nurses, Hitler youths, women, and some older factory workers who could be spared for a few hours. This was the speech of his life that earned him even the Führer's praise. Screaming at the top of his voice, he closed each sentence with the devious question, "Do you want total war?" which his war-weary listeners always answered with a desperate yes. It was a masterstroke of propaganda that mobilized the last reserves of a nation on the verge of exhaustion. From everywhere within the German war machinery, from the armaments industry and agriculture to universities and the Luftwaffe, the last able-bodied men flocked to the army to fill the ranks of the divisions that were slowly bleeding to death. Göring's telegram was followed by a flood of special instructions. 50 men immediately had to be sent to Kirkenes for training by battle-hardened instructors from the mountaineers. A week later, another 50 were to go, then another, until the last able-bodied foot soldier of the Petsamo Air Base had joined the mountaineers. Helmut was among the first to go because he had aroused the commander's ire by putting a bunk bed in the underground command center. I was among the last. The commander, a lieutenant colonel, did not want to let me go, but I knew that my time had come. I certainly did not want to spend this critical phase of the war in relative safety and comfort. I was ready to lay my life on the line. With the commander's concurrence, I was already training my replacement, a 60-year-old man from the organization TOT, the equivalent of the American Corps of Engineers, who was hard of hearing and short of military skills. Wherever I looked, I saw personnel shortages. There were not enough men for loading bombs, standing watch, defending against air attacks, and guarding against Russian commandos operating behind the lines. The commander sent urgent telegrams to higher headquarters in Oslo, pleading for an exemption from the relentless requisition of his last able-bodied soldiers, but to no avail. At the end of February 1943, I received my marching orders. The commander decorated me with the Cross for Distinguished War Service Second Class. Then it was time for me to go. In total darkness, I climbed on a truck that took me to the Kirkenes Air Base. The newly established Luftwaffen Field Brigade for the Arctic Ocean Front had a training camp there for one of its companies. I met a few friends from Petsamo, though not Helmut. He had joined another company somewhere else. Now I was a Lancer, as the German infantrymen called themselves. I suppose the expression stems from Landsknecht, which was the German name for mercenaries in the Middle Ages. The conventional translation is Landsquené, and the literal interpretation is land serf. For the German soldier, the word Lanzer had a nostalgic ring, which reverberated through many songs such as, "What in the world can the Lanzer dream of? He dreams of his sweetheart." As much as I hated to be a soldier, at this moment I was not proud but content to be a Lanzer, fully aware that the hardest time of the war had begun. Immediately upon arrival, I was ordered to report to the first lieutenant from the mountain troops who was in charge of training. From the very beginning, there was a mutual, instinctive mistrust between us that reminded me of my strained relation with Heino, the former Jungvolk leader. I also felt a similar fear, a kind of unspecific angst, though on a minor scale. Since I was now more mature and experienced, I could cope with such fear better than in my childhood. Good-looking, arrogant, decorated and vain, the lieutenant was a fanatic soldier and an exacting superior. As had been Heino's aspiration, his ambition was to forge us into competent fighters. Ironically, that was exactly what I had in mind. Indeed, both of us were there for the same reason. The only difference was that I considered fighting and bravery a means to an end, whereas he saw them as values in themselves. He resented my pensiveness and slightly unsoldierly composure, and I his arrogance and insensitivity. Training was extremely hard and sometimes brought us close to the breaking point. In stark contrast to the useless parade drill we had received at the beginning of the war, this training was strictly no-nonsense, designed exclusively to teach us fighting skills. Part of it was on foot, part on skis. A classic infantry attack cannot be carried out on skis, but must be performed on foot, since it alternates between lying on the ground or in the snow and jumping ahead. On the other hand, activities such as reconnaissance and hauling supplies were performed on skis. We wore hooded white winter suits over our ordinary army uniform. In almost any climate, this outfit would have kept us warm, but in this murderously cold weather, nothing was warm enough. We always carried our backpacks with all our belongings, plus ammunition. This made us so heavy that sometimes we sank up to our arms in the snow. The most severe test was a 5-day maneuver carried out on foot. It alternated between long marches and special exercises, such as reconnaissance, attacking, escaping an ambush, and most dreadful setting up camp. We did not have the splendid tents of today, but triangular tarpaulins that had to be buttoned together to form a tent. In the extreme cold and darkness of the Arctic winter, handling the aluminum buttons was an almost impossible task that everybody tried to avoid. I saw men crying while doing this job. Digging holes in the snow and filling them with brushwood was a picnic in comparison. When a tent was finished, it was a covered hole in the snow, in which one could freeze to death, but not sleep. Fire and lights were not allowed during the entire exercise. The whole situation had to be as realistic as possible, which meant, among other things, complete darkness and merciless exposure to the environment. The instructors from the mountain troops had gone through similar tribulations while facing the enemy, so they saw no reason to save us from any hardship they had endured. Huddled together in our tents, we anxiously waited for the morning, which brought neither light nor warmth, but at least some relief from the extra freezing caused by immobility. On the march back to barracks, it became obvious that the lieutenant, who conducted the affair on skis, had overestimated our endurance and underestimated the elements. Already close to exhaustion, we were caught in a snowstorm that almost buried us. The company broke up into ever smaller groups that desperately fought their way back to the camp. Fortunately, they all made it, but some only after long delays and with severe frostbite. The lieutenant, who could have been court-martialed if there had been fatalities, anxiously awaited the arrival of each group. My group was one of the first to arrive, yet when I reported the men under my command safe and sound, he dismissed me with his usual disdain. Fortunately, we soon got rid of this unpleasant specimen of an officer. It happened when the whole battalion was assembled for its first assignment, at which time ordinary commanders were installed on all levels. The new battalion commander, a captain, would play an important role in my future life until the very end of the war. At our first encounter, he scolded me for a lax salute. A mountaineer and a native of Bavaria, He tried to be as severe and demanding as the lieutenant who had just departed, but he was not as convincing. Though he later earned himself the Knight's Cross and a promotion to Major, I had the impression that he felt insecure and that his lack of self-assurance was the prime reason why he barked so much. After Germany had surrendered, he made the telling remark, "Now I have to sell shoelaces again." As corporal, I was the leader of a group of 15 men. 12 of them carried rifles, 3 operated a machine gun, and I carried a submachine gun. Our main duty was to guard a huge power station near Kolosyoki, which provided the electricity for processing the nickel ore. The Corps of Engineers was encasing the vital parts of the plant in concrete to protect it from air attacks. Since they were working day and night, the construction site was brilliantly illuminated, in spite of potential air attacks. Our second duty was performing reconnaissance runs along the power line that was subject to sabotage by Russian commandos. Since the front was not a continuous line, but a chain of strongpoints separated by long stretches of tundra, it was frequently penetrated by commandos from both sides. They sometimes operated up to 30 kilometers behind enemy lines. Because there was snow on the ground most of the time, the reconnaissance runs were mostly performed on skis. There was always the danger of running into an ambush, a contingency for which we were especially trained. At the command Richard, a reconnaissance column would swing out in a row to the right and try to fall into the back of the attacker. At the command Ludwig, the same move would be carried out to the left. There were other maneuvers for all sorts of situations that sometimes saved us casualties. At one such occasion I gave the Richard command, but only with limited success. We avoided casualties but were unable to inflict any on the enemy. There were also mines. The Russians knew our paths and mined them, as we did theirs. In spite of all warnings and precautions, we soon had our first casualties. We were looking for mines under the snow, but the Russians had just invented a new booby trap that hung in the brush. One such contraption maimed the faces of 3 of my men beyond recognition. One did not survive his cruel evacuation on makeshift sleds. In the summer of 1943, my group of 15 was assigned to Fort Romanov, a promontory at the Arctic coast between Petsamo and the Fisher Peninsula. Our mission was to provide infantry protection to the naval artillery stationed there. The fort, a Gibraltar-like rock protruding into the Arctic Ocean, was subject to almost continuous bombardment from the superior Russian artillery on the Fisher Peninsula. When a convoy with war material from America was approaching Murmansk, the artillery barrage rose to a hurricane. Each shell generated a hail of iron and stone on the naked rock. Some of the Navy gunners opined that the mounted guns of the Russians, which took a heavy toll among us, could only have come from America, but others pointed out that the Russians had been excellent artillerymen ever since Peter the Great. At any rate, the Navy cannoneers took the brunt of the barrages because they had to return fire, while the infantrymen at least could seek cover in caves and crevices. There were 2 exceptions, however. One was carrying the wounded to a little boat that took them to a military hospital in Kirkenes. I hated this task ever since a severely burned artilleryman had begged me to kill him. The other exception happened at one of our reconnaissance runs. These runs took place along the cliffs above the ocean. On one such trip, while we were descending, we came under heavy artillery fire that drove us into an almost hopeless situation. Since I was ahead of my group, I was at the lowest point. Hanging on the cliff, unable to go either up or down, and being responsible for 12 men, I was in desperate need of mountaineering skills, which I did not possess, of physical bravery, which I am not abundantly endowed with, and of leadership qualities which, I suppose, I gained on that special occasion. Momentarily paralyzed by fear and acrophobia, I told myself that I had to hide this spell of weakness from my men at all cost. That helped. At the first pause in the shelling, I directed the topmost man to climb back up the same way he had come down. At the next pause, the second man ascended, and so on. When it was my turn to scale the cliff, I had the benefit of having been shown the way by my unsuspecting men. Nevertheless, the 2 hours I was hanging there seemed like an eternity to me. In the fall of 1943, our entire battalion was assigned to the Litza front, about 50 kilometers west of Murmansk. This part of the Arctic Ocean front along the Litza River consisted of a chain of strongholds that were separated by vast stretches of no man's land. Generally, a stronghold was occupied by one platoon, about 45 men. In 1941, the mountaineers had suffered huge losses there, as was testified by the large army cemetery at Parkkina, part of the Petsamo area. When we retreated from Finland in 1944, losses were even greater, but only the lucky comrades were buried. Most had to be left where they died. Now, in 1943, casualties were more moderate, and the Parkkina cemetery had no trouble accommodating them. Military operations consisted mainly of sniper fire, reconnaissance, and local surprise attacks that sometimes resulted in hand-to-hand fighting. The Russians also shelled us with heavy artillery, which we did not have. The Lanza's life at these strongholds was so primitive that it almost defies description. 1/3 of the platoon, about 15 men, were always on their way to haul supplies of food, water, coal, ammunition, and so forth. Another 15 men were standing guard. The remainder were either sleeping or doing chores such as cleaning weapons or cracking lice. All 45 men lived in a handmade bunker with a floor space of about 50 square meters, but only 1/3 of them could sleep there at any one time. There was only one wash bowl in which everything was cleaned, from feet to clothes to dishes. Since detergents were non-existent and soap was scarce, the bowl had a thick black rim of indeterminate composition. Light was provided by a handmade carbide lamp that consisted of an open can, a wine bottle, a wick, a cork, and a rifle bullet. The bottle, which contained the carbide, stood in the water bath of the can. It had a hole in the bottom for the wick to draw water from the can and the carbide to generate gas. The slender rifle bullet penetrated the cork with its tip pointing upwards. By drilling a hole along its length axis, the bullet was converted into a nozzle for the gas to escape. I don't know who invented this contraption, but when I saw it for the first time, I was quite impressed by this kind of Lanza ingenuity. There was no room in the bunker for even the most modest personal belongings, except for paper and pencil to write letters. No books, no musical instruments, no pictures, certainly no radio, nothing but weapons, ammunition, and the bare essentials of existence. The only picture that graced the entrance door was a huge poster depicting the anatomy of a louse, courtesy of the German army. Underneath was the official form on which everybody had to report every day how many lice he had cracked. A pencil was provided. Today I wish I had at least one photograph of the bunker idol, but there were no cameras. One of the scarcest commodities was the truth. There were essentially 3 sources of information: the monthly Das Reich, the soldiers' radio station at Finnmark, and comrades returning from home leave. The monthly was controlled by the Ministry for Propaganda and regularly brought the latest pep talk by Goebbels. The battalion received 1 copy, which was passed on to officers and occasionally reached our bunker. The radio sender was the official mouthpiece of the 20th Mountain Army. Yet there were no radios in the bunkers, and only one at the battalion command post. I do recall having heard there the announcement, "We now read to you the article that Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels has just published in the magazine Das Reich." Thus, as far as real information was concerned, we were essentially left with the news the men on leave brought from home. Yet even this information was tainted by the Goebbels propaganda machine. Nevertheless, occasionally the truth leaked through. To me, this happened a year later when a comrade brought me the only news I ever received about the concentration camps. Our pay resembled the information we received. Both were false. We were paid with 3 sorts of money: Russian rubles, German Kreditkassenscheine, certificates of credit equivalent to ordinary Reichsmark, and Finnish marks. The rubles, huge notes bearing the portrait of Lenin and the emblem of hammer and sickle, were entirely worthless and all ended in the latrine. The German Kreditkassenscheine were a classic example of funny money. The only thing we could buy with them was tobacco and alcohol, which, however, were strictly rationed. Since we received more funny money than we could spend, we accumulated it in our mandatory chest money pouches. Eventually, these leather purses became so bulging that the Lanzas referred to them as braziers. The markers had a limited buying power, since Finland had been bled white by several wars. Of course, we were far away from even the smallest Finnish town where we could have bought something with the Finn mark, as we called it, except on our way to and from home leave. But even this limited shopping opportunity was too much of a burden for the Finnish economy, which is why we received ever fewer markers and eventually none. The mood in the bunker was a blend of all sorts of emotions, some buried in the depth of the Lancers' souls, others lying closer to the surface. At the bottom of the collective psyche subsisted a stoic resignation to the inevitable. Next came a sense of duty that was tempered with fear of injury, death, and Russian captivity. This sentiment, I suppose, was not much different from the feelings of the men in the trenches of World War I, regardless of which side they fought on. But the faith in the Führer, which lay a little closer to the surface, was totally new. Instilled by education, propaganda, indoctrination, even the oath of personal loyalty, it differed greatly from one man to the next, unshakable in some, riddled with doubt in others. It goes without saying that the believers were more vocal than the doubters. The most openly admitted sentiment of the men in the bunker was an endemic homesickness that led to endless talks, reminiscences, fantasies, lamentations, even poetry. But the most palpable temper in the bunker was an all-pervading mutual irritation that flared up at the slightest provocation. One comrade, who was from Berlin, often sang a nostalgic ditty that ended on the refrain, "When the church bells are ringing again, yes, then will be peace in Berlin." Another offered a more humorous rhyme that depicted the homecoming of the last soldiers from the Arctic Ocean front, years after the war had ended in victory. The Führer had long retired to his comfortable residence in Linz, Austria, and everybody was enjoying peace and prosperity. In that cosy situation, nobody recognized the ragged, toothless homecomers who were pulling mules behind them. When the bearded warriors were asked whence they came, they always gave the same lethargic answer, "From the ass of the world." Life in the bunker was so stressful that the inhabitants had difficulties keeping their irritation in check, and elders had their hands full maintaining peace. For me, the greatest hardship was the physical closeness of men and their smell. To this day, I have to turn my nose away when soldiers are marching by. Strangely, most inhabitants of the bunker did not complain about the smell, but all suffered from the lack of privacy. The result was tensions that could erupt at any moment into open hostility. When one man felt annoyed by another, he yelled at him, "You stink to me!" In spite of my own suffering, I noticed the expression with muted amusement and wondered to what extent human relations are subconsciously affected by smell. It seemed to me that the graphic expression was less of a metaphor than the Lancers suspected. At any rate, as far as my nose was concerned, my discomfort was real, not metaphorical. My pastime in the bunker was writing letters to my parents and to Paul, my friend from the Neuruppin airbase. Unfortunately, the letters to my parents got lost in the bombing raids, and those to Paul disappeared with him in Siberia. As far as I know, only one of my letters survived the war. I had written it to an aunt of mine, who presented it to me after the war in her defense against my criticism of her continued adherence to Nazi ideology. It was a typical political holdout letter in which I rambled on about victory and praised Hitler for having appointed Himmler, of all people, to a high position on the Eastern Front. At the time, I did not know anything about the genocide that Hitler had ordered and Himmler had organized. I simply thought that the old party champion and SS leader would make a good fighter against communism. Of course, I was wrong on that account, for Himmler proved militarily incompetent, but that was not why the letter embarrassed me when my aunt showed it to me. I was ashamed because it revealed the blind faith I once had placed in precisely the two men who had conceived and unleashed the Holocaust. At the time, I thought the Russians were better off than we were. For one thing, they were supported by a more developed hinterland of roads and railways. They also had the ingenuity to put railroad tracks over frozen lakes, which enabled them to employ heavy artillery and even tanks. Most important, however, was their numerical superiority, which allowed them to concentrate manpower at strategic places and launch surprise attacks. The unit opposite us was a Siberian reindeer ski brigade that enjoyed several advantages over us. Apart from being more familiar with the climate, they were also better equipped for it. We envied them the padded uniforms they wore under their white winter suits, which not only kept them warm, but also made them look more massive than they probably were. The Siberians were also masters at using the knife as a weapon. I don't know if they had learned this savage art from the Finns during the Winter War of 1939, or vice versa, but both excelled in it. It reminded me of the German author Karl May, who wrote popular stories about the American Wild West and the Indians. The Siberians were able to spend hours in the snow while sneaking up on our guards. While this alone was sufficient to make standing watch a nerve-wracking experience, it was exacerbated by the climate, the darkness, and the landscape. There were no trees, but only brush, moss, and huge boulders. If one stared long enough at a large rock, it started to move as if it were a man. The worst part of it was that one never knew whether or not to alert sleeping comrades. Sounding a false alarm always had unpleasant consequences, but failing to sound an alarm in the presence of a real threat was an invitation to disaster. We always slept in our uniforms, minus winter suits, covered with one blanket that was standard equipment, loaded rifles at our sides, and winter suits and shoes as pillows under our heads. My political views had changed in the last 2 years. Since I was no longer subjected to anti-Semitic propaganda and had not seen the Stürmer magazine for 3 years, I had almost forgotten the horror story of the Jewish conspiracy. My thoughts and feelings were focused almost exclusively on the Russians. The thought that they might defeat us and occupy our homeland terrified me. Even more horrifying was the possibility of falling into Russian captivity. Like many of my comrades, I was determined to end my life rather than march to Siberia. Such thoughts and the daily struggle for survival convinced me that this war was not against Jews, but against Russia, notwithstanding the fact that America, which had many Jews, had joined our enemies. At the time, why and how America got into a war against us was a mystery to me. That the British were still fighting us was bad enough, but at least I could rationalize this calamity as a kind of private bout between Hitler and Churchill. But why America? About President Roosevelt I knew next to nothing. Could it be that he was another Churchill? If so, what a coincidence. Pearl Harbor was long forgotten, and so was Hitler's irrational declaration of war on America. Had the memory of this rash reaction endured in my mind, it might have planted some doubts about Hitler's judgment and leadership qualities. On the other hand, I must admit that I probably would have suppressed such doubts with the expedient justification that I lacked the information to understand the fine points of world politics. Since I had grown up with the slanted worldview of the Nazis, I was not aware of America's industrial might, and even less so of its spiritual power, which I comprehended only many years later when I became an American. Had I known these fundamental facts, I might have come to the conclusion that we could not win this war even with the best of luck. But my mind was fixated on the Russians, and my hope was that we could still beat them. Apart from the Russians, only the British occupied my thoughts to such a significant extent. If Churchill had never been born, or if he suddenly died, would peace with England be possible? Would it be desirable or even prudent? Wasn't that what Rudolf Hess had in mind when he flew to England? Of course he was in disgrace now, but according to the Bible, a prophet has little credibility in his own land. The thought frightened me, because it implied that Hitler might not be as wise as I wanted to believe he was. Since I was not ready for such heresy, I quelled any further brooding about the subject with the cheap excuse that I lacked the necessary information for independent thinking. There was one more problem, however. In spite of the news blackout, it had not escaped me that Hitler had not spoken to the nation or the Reichstag for quite some time. For a speaker of his caliber, the present quietude was conspicuous, not to say ominous. In his stead, Goebbels spoke to us through the periodical Das Reich. But Goebbels' carefully crafted articles were a poor substitute for Hitler's invigorating speeches. Indeed, from the propaganda minister's recent article, I got the impression that the skillful wordsmith had trouble hiding his own anxiety. One sentence in particular worried me. Wie weit wollen wir uns denn noch absetzen? How far do we still want to distance ourselves? The verb absetzen has several meanings. In the present context, it means to put some distance between us and the enemy. Thus, it was a euphemism for retreat, which the Army High Command had invented to rationalize the backward movements on all fronts. It troubled me that the Führer's closest paladins saw fit to borrow this dubious expression from the generals. But there were also positive signs. The periodical, which brought us Goebbels' pep talks, if we were so lucky to receive it, was also sprinkled with vague hints about new miracle weapons, such as jet fighters, rockets, guided missiles, and superior tanks. Undoubtedly, these secret weapons under development were the explanation for the Führer's persistent silence. Maybe he was busy preparing the decisive blow. He had always used the element of surprise. No doubt he would use it again. At any rate, at this fateful hour, he needed our trust, and he certainly had mine. At about the same time, I started to let my comrades in on my thinking, which so far I had kept mostly to myself. My foremost objective was to strengthen fighting spirit. We had to win this war at all cost. Our enemies were Russia, Russia, Russia. To mention the Jews in this context was absurd. To my surprise, most of my comrades agreed. Indeed, the few critics I encountered went even a step further. They did not want to hear about the Jews at all. One of my comrades, who had just returned from home leave, seemed to have some information about the Gestapo. He was careful not to attack Hitler, but he told me to my face that Himmler had converted Europe into a giant jail. This man was the most outspoken critic of the Nazi regime in our company. He was a sergeant, and I was a corporal. Thus, we were both non-commissioned officers, and he was one rank higher than I. About 5 years older than I, he was a student of law from Vienna. His name, ironically, was Walter Führer, which he regretted and tried to diffuse with the earthy doggerel Führer Walter, when he farts he thunders, which in German rhymes quite convincingly. We had numerous discussions, mostly in hushed voices because, inside the bunker, the comrades wanted to sleep, and outside the enemy was too close. Once we were fortunate enough to attend a movie theatre for soldiers just a few kilometres behind the front. The price of admission was 1 log of firewood. When technical difficulties delayed the movie, we finally had the opportunity to conduct our discussion in relative comfort. Walter denounced the race ideology as hocus-pocus, a characterization to which I no longer objected. But our opinions deviated when it came to more concrete issues, such as the war and the fate of his homeland, Austria. He thought that the war was already lost, and that Austria should be free and independent, whereas I took the position that the war was winnable, and Austria was an integral part of Germany. Finally, the movie started. Though it was a German production, it was unadulterated Hollywood. Against the moonlit background of a beautiful beach on the Mediterranean, under palm trees and overhanging bougainvilleas, a ladykiller in a white suit sang, "If only I knew whom I had kissed one midnight at the Lido." Did we really need this? My stomach was empty. My eyes were burning from the smoke of the wood fire. My feet were cold in spite of the fire, and my mind was still upset by the unresolved issues I had just discussed with Walter. In about 2 hours, we would return to a life of death and misery. And now this. Who were the idiots who had sent us this schmaltz? When we reported back to the company commander, Walter claimed, probably with some exaggeration, that I had lifted his spirit. The company commander, a second lieutenant, was not a Nazi, but a reasonable man who simply did his duty as a reserve officer. He was not much interested in ideology, but appreciated it if somebody did something to lift the fighting spirit. Walter and I sometimes poked fun at him behind his back because he had the peculiar habit of closing each sentence with the rhetorical question, "Can you follow?" Nevertheless, he seemed to feel that I was able to follow his high-flying thoughts, for he advanced my modest military career more than any other superior. The company commander was a native of Dortmund, which was another factor in the rapidly developing rapport between us. Most of the officers of the battalion were South Germans, either Austrians or Bavarians, and the popular bias among North Germans was that the Austrians had too much and the Bavarians too little of manners and civility. While the two southern clans were not exactly fond of each other, they agreed that the Prussians were faceless yes-men who had neither humour nor culture. I do not subscribe to these clichés, but it still intrigues me that Hitler was an Austrian by birth and a Bavarian by choice. He hated Vienna as much as he loved Munich, and yet he was incapable of grasping the spirit of either city. The company commander, being a Prius, suffered from isolation among his fellow officers. Prius is southern lingo for Prussian, and has a slightly derogatory connotation. Since I tried to dampen regional animosities wherever I noticed them, he called me a pan-Germanic wizard, and even a wise man, though he was at least 10 years my senior. It was a strange relation, strictly formal, with lots of "can you follow?" and spiced with occasional lecturing and left-handed compliments. Nevertheless, this man was the most pleasant military superior I ever had, and I was eager to reciprocate. Soon I would have 2 opportunities to do so, but each time special circumstances hid my acts of gratitude from him. First, I saved his daily fried potatoes from a repulsive kind of pollution, and a year later I saved his life. This officer would soon give me 2 assignments that caused quite a change of my military career. But first he surprised me with a reward of an entirely non-military nature. He had nominated me to attend a concert for front soldiers in Kirkenes. Each company could send only 1 man there, and each nomination had to be approved by the battalion commander. The battalion commander, a captain whom I mentioned earlier, was a Bavarian by birth and a Kommissar by choice. This is a slightly derogatory name for a person who is nothing but a soldier. Like Kommissbrot, army bread, the name is based on the word Kommiss, which the Lancers used for the Wehrmacht as long as their feelings toward it were neutral. In a more aggravated mood, they used the harsher term Barras, the origin of which I don't know. Being a Kommissar par excellence, the captain considered music a decadent pursuit and even forbade the singing of Christmas carols on the grounds that they weakened the fighting spirit. He was not our friend, neither the lieutenant's nor mine. The more surprising was it that he had granted permission for me to attend the concert. A little later I should learn what was behind this unexpected favour. It was a long trip to the concert in Kirkenes, first on skis, then by truck, and finally on foot. The pianist played the A major sonata by Mozart. The first movement, the Andante Grazioso, in spite of its soothing mood, or because of it, struck me with such force that I had trouble hiding my emotion. When one suddenly emerges from a life of utter insensitivity into an environment of sheer beauty, the effect can be dramatic. A whirlwind of sentiments and questions raced through my mind and almost spoiled my pleasure. But when the pianist played Beethoven, I regained my composure. Shortly thereafter, the company commander gave me the first of the 2 assignments I alluded to earlier. It was a position within the company, which was called Kompanie Truppführer. As such, I was the commander's deputy and the leader of an elite group of 5 men who served as messengers to platoons and battalion headquarters. Hitler had been such a messenger during World War I. As Kompanie Truppführer, I took part in tactical planning concerning reconnaissance, forecasting enemy attacks, allocating manpower, and so on. I liked the new assignment because it offered me at least some relief from the bunker routine by allowing me to visit the platoons on their strongholds. It also offered me the first of the 2 opportunities to pay my debt to the commander. Messengers and I were stationed at the same bunker as the company commander. One of my men had to prepare the lieutenant's fried potatoes every morning. The dish was not at all as appetizing as the name may suggest. For one thing, the little grease the lieutenant could spare from his daily ration had to be augmented by coffee grounds, which was not coffee at all, but a barley brew. The worst ingredient, however, was the potatoes, which were almost black from frost and rot. One morning, when the familiar stink of the commander's fried potatoes drifted through the bunker, I absent-mindedly watched the man who was preparing them. Obviously he was mad at the lieutenant, for he referred to him repeatedly as a swine dog. That caught my attention. To my dismay, I noticed that the angry cook spit into the potatoes each time he pronounced the unflattering sobriquet. For a moment I didn't know what to do, for I did not want to get between the lieutenant and my men. Eventually I ordered the disloyal chef to discard the dish and prepare a new one from his and my ration, which was quite a sacrifice for both of us. I later learned that the untrustworthy cook had used the revolting recipe for quite some time, but the lieutenant had never heard of it. I pledged to myself never to offend a cook. I enjoyed my solitary trips to the strongholds, though they brought additional danger because both sides tried to capture messengers. Soon I would have even more opportunity to move around. General Ferdinand Schorner, commanding general of the 19th Mountain Army Corps, had ordered the installation of National Socialist leadership officers at all levels. With this enactment, Schorner anticipated Hitler's order of July 1944 to appoint such officers in all of the armed services, which was a reaction to the attempt on his life. The new institution was not much different from the Soviet commissars, but the Wehrmacht, by emphasizing the purely ideological nature of this function, great pains to convince the Lancers that there was a world of difference. For the installation of the NS leadership officers, each company had to send 2 men to battalion command post. To my surprise, I was ordered to attend this ceremony. The delegates from the 4 companies reported to a second lieutenant, whom I later called Joseph because he rivaled Joseph Goebbels in the art of twisting words. A few months later I would have a bout with him, but at the moment we were on friendly terms. Joseph vigorously shook my hand, which was quite unusual between commissioned and non-commissioned officers. Then he said that my company commander had praised me as an exemplary National Socialist, and that the battalion commander had approved my nomination as the company's NS leadership officer. The permission to attend the concert in Kirkenes, he said, was a reward for my ideological reliability. I had the impression that Joseph liked me, while I was still struggling with the old problem that ideologically I was mostly on the side of the Nazis, but personally I had a hard time getting along with them. In this regard, Joseph was no exception. It turned out that Joseph was the battalion NS leadership officer. In this capacity, he now presented us to the battalion commander, a captain who reminded me of Old Grouch, the Hitler youth leader of olden days. His specialty was den Lanzer anzuscheißen, literally, to shit sideways at the Lanzer, for being improperly dressed or giving a lax salute or whatever. Anscheißen was one of the great words from the Lancers' vocabulary. No other expression could relate more graphically the feeling of being scolded by some simpleton for some trifle while standing at attention. As the captain inspected us, he wasted no time demonstrating his mastery of the art of Anscheißen. First, he admonished the group for its non-uniform appearance. 4 of us appeared in white and 4 in grey. Then he rebuked me for not standing correctly at attention. After this inspiring introduction, he gave a little speech that apparently was meant to be a pep talk, but turned out to be a demonstration of spiritual poverty. Long on bombast and short on meaning, the pathetic address caused only a mixture of amusement and embarrassment. After a while, the dull speaker felt his own inadequacy and murmured, "Bah, why do I talk so much? Words are not my cup of tea." With that, he turned around and left us more confused than enlightened. Now it was Joseph's turn. He was a history teacher, and it showed. His talk was relatively well designed, full of quotes and historical facts or distortions, but not convincing, at least not to me. He began his sermon with the tired race ideology. Opening a field edition of Hitler's Mein Kampf, he thundered, "The Aryan has always been mankind's Prometheus." The mindless claim rang a bell with me, for it was the same phrase I had absorbed in my school days when I was most gullible. Now it sounded less convincing, particularly when Joseph contrasted it with the 1,000-year-old dictum ex oriente lux, from the east comes the light, which sounded rather elegant by comparison. Curiously, it was this cryptic phrase that aroused his ire, for he repeated it several times during the course of his lecture, while making a face as if it were the dirtiest of lies. Not satisfied that his facial artistry had brought home the message, he topped the facile phrase off with the awkward remark, "However, light does not come from the east, but from the north." I thought this sweeping statement sounded even more artless than the Führer's. Though he was smart enough not to point north, I couldn't help turning my eyes in that direction, and saw only barbed wire, snow, and a black sky. The long-winded lecture on the origin of Aryan light was only an overture to the long-forgotten fairy tale of the Jewish world conspiracy. My God, did this man hate the Jews! I suddenly felt transported back to my school days, when I had heard the director cracking dirty jokes about lecherous old men in caftans. I even saw him plucking his goatee while sounding his obnoxious laugh. But that was long ago, Now we were facing a real enemy, not a bogeyman that existed only in hysterical minds. Nobody around here, save this idiot, had any taste for the old Sturmer canards. I was disgusted. I was desperate. It took all my self-control to repress the outcry. God save us from this National Socialist leadership officer. Early in 1944, our battalion was reassigned to the Fischer-Hals front, which ran across the isthmus of the Fischer Peninsula west of Murmansk. The peninsula itself was in Russian hands, but we controlled the mainland south of it, including the isthmus. The artillery fire was most intense there. Thanks to the Americans, the Russians seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of ammunition, which enticed them to fire even at one-man targets. By now I had acquired some fame within the battalion as ideological holdout apostle, which brought me speaking engagements from companies other than my own. They all wanted to hear my pep talks. I unabashedly preached my conviction that our enemy was Russia and Russia alone. I even went so far as to declare that we urgently needed peace with Britain and America, but stopped short of saying that entering the war in North Africa had been a strategic mistake, because that would have been a reflection on Hitler's leadership qualities. It was clear to me that half of the German forces were deployed in Italy and the Balkans and the Atlantic coast. If they were freed to fight the Russians, we would still have a chance to beat them. I even dreamt of an alliance between Germany and the Western powers. Little did I know that the unconditional surrender of Germany had long been their declared war goal, and even less did I realize that Germany's enormous war crimes had poisoned the political atmosphere to such an extent that a settlement with the West was impossible. In general, my heretical preaching was well received. Eventually, however, somebody must have complained about me, for I was suddenly summoned to the battalion command post. To my relief, the commander was not present, and Joseph received me in his stead. He seemed to be well informed about my ideas, and even quoted some of them verbally. "There is some truth in what you say about England and America," he lectured me. "But we must leave thinking about these problems to the Führer. He knows best." With that, I was graciously dismissed, happy in the belief that my unorthodox preaching would have no further consequences. I was grievously mistaken. Soon after my audience with Joseph, I learned that my political escapades had an entirely unexpected effect on one of my comrades, whose name was Roper. His life eventually ended in tragedy, while mine was never the same.